Hey guys, it's Devest. Today I wanted to tell you the truth about the Iraq War. Let's get into it. Let's start with the biggest lie, which is that the Bush administration lied about weapons of mass destruction as an excuse to invade Iraq. So first off, they didn't need to lie to justify an invasion of Iraq. They listed 11 other reasons with the 2002 authorization of use of force to invade Iraq. So if they legitimately didn't have a reason to believe Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, then there was no reason to list it on there and sully their reputation based on a lie. This also begs the question of why Bush didn't also claim that the Taliban were pursuing weapons of mass destruction in Afghanistan. The reality is that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons and was pursuing other weapons of mass destruction, but was stopped by the destruction of his regime during the invasion. That's the point missed when people make memes like, "We can't invade North Korea, they have weapons of mass destruction." It's like saying they lied about Nazi Germany pursuing the atomic bomb just because they never actually nuked anybody. More importantly, we actually did find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but the media presents this fact disingenuously so that the vast majority of people who can't form abstract thoughts will be unable to make the connection. First off, they focus on American soldiers being injured by chemical weapons disposal and accuse a second cover-up of weapons of mass destruction, now claiming that Bush hid evidence of the chemical weapons to avoid making America look bad because they sold weapons to the Iraqis during the Iran-Iraq War. Another line when the media acknowledges the fact Iraq had chemical weapons is that the Iraqis had disposed of them per the demands of the United Nations, by burying them and then losing track of where they were buried. This is something else that makes sense only if you are ignorant enough to not be able to think abstractly. In reality, Saddam Hussein's plan was to hide himself, his inner circle, and his most valuable weapons underground because he expected the coalition to occupy his country for a short period of time before leaving, at which point his mostly intact government could emerge and use their weapons to reassume control of the country. We know this is the case because the people who carried out this program told us that is what they did. And if you're going through the effort of stashing entire fighter jets in the desert, then you're already past the point of stashing artillery shells underground. Another common line against the invasion was the fact that the United Nations Security Council didn't provide a unanimous decision authorizing the invasion. France, Russia, and China opposed the invasion. Additionally, Germany was a powerful American ally who opposed the invasion, though they didn't have a seat on the UNSC. This wasn't because the Russian, Chinese, French, or German governments believed that Saddam Hussein was innocent. This was because certain people in powerful positions in their government benefited from the United Nations relationship with Saddam Hussein. Under the United Nations brokered oil for food program, billions of dollars was paid as bribes to various European officials as Saddam Hussein traded oil on the black market to Russia, France, and China in exchange for weapons. The German chancellor at the time, Gerhard Schröder, is also infamous for his relationship with Russian energy companies too. So it only makes sense that these countries would side with their trading partner. The only way Bush could have gotten these sleazeballs to support the invasion is if he promised them bigger bribes than what Saddam Hussein could offer. Anyways, all of the reasons listed on the Iraq resolution are absolutely correct, including the fact Saddam Hussein was in possession of chemical weapons and pursued other weapons of mass destruction. After his defeat during the Gulf War, he also aligned himself with Sunni extremists like Al-Qaeda. He was a brutal dictator and already did a ton of damage. Even if the narrative Bush lied, people died was true, I would support it, just as a means to an end. A legitimate tactic to scare the sheepish masses into recognizing a direct threat to their well-being and mobilizing them to a righteous cause. Now let's address the most common supposed reason for Bush to invade Iraq, which was to steal their oil. The Food for Oil program already took the oil wealth away from the Iraqis and handed it to Saddam Hussein and his black market trading partners. The invasion actually put the oil wealth into the hands of the people, not into the hands of any Americans. Out of the 24 oil fields in Iraq, only 2 of them are serviced by American companies, due in part to the fact that the United States is not competitive when it comes to extracting easy Arab oil. The United States can only compete when it comes to extracting and refining unconventional oil and gas like in Venezuela. Otherwise, countries with lower labor costs will win out. Additionally, most of Iraq's cheap oil is sold to Asian countries like India and China, cutting into the demand and consequently value of American oil. If anything, it seems like the situation in Iraq worked out best for the Chinese and Iran. They got a stable Iraqi government selling them more cheap oil, and Iran got a friendly government replacing the one that was trying to beat the Mongolians' record for killing the most Iranians. These are all observable economic facts if you bothered to research the economy of Iraq, which none of the normies have bothered to do. Now let's talk about the consequences of the invasion. First off, the death count. I see the number 2 million thrown around a lot, and that is just straight up fake. The methodology they used to come to that conclusion was to ask Iraqis if they knew someone who died due to the war, and then extrapolate based on the number of people who said yes to determine that 2 million people had died. Here's how you could abuse that methodology to make up a fake number, though. Imagine you went to a funeral and asked 40 people if they knew the person who died. Then you assumed each person saying yes was talking about a different person who died. Iraq body count has a much more realistic death count, skewed with an overtly anti-American objective in their reporting. They record 25,000 civilians killed by the coalition over 14 years of conflict, against an estimate of 187 to 210,000 civilian deaths in total, the rest being the result of anti-coalition insurgents. By comparison, during the 11-week-long Normandy campaign, the Allies killed about 70,000 French civilians. So obviously these deaths at the hands of coalition members were all tragic, but there's no indication they were part of some deliberate policy of killing or even disregarding civilian lives. The vast majority of civilian deaths were to the insurgents. Even still, the amount of death and violence in Iraq was reduced massively compared to the reign of Saddam Hussein. 300,000 dead over 14 years if you include the terrorists. Saddam killed that many people over a single year. This makes sense when you consider the second common claim about the consequences of the invasion, which is that Saddam Hussein was keeping the Islamic extremists out, and the Islamic State came to power because he was deposed. In reality, ISIS was just an evolution of the Ba'ath Party, formed from the remnants of Saddam Hussein's loyalists, with whatever support they could scrounge up from Russia, their best ally. And ISIS was a shell of the power that Saddam held, both physically with their lack of arms and ammunition and with their lack of legitimacy. Saying the invasion of Iraq was wrong because it gave birth to ISIS is like saying that defeating Hitler was wrong because it gave birth to the neo-Nazi movement. Finally, let's talk about the coalition war crimes. The people involved in Abu Ghraib torture were definitely criminals, but they also weren't following an official policy set forth by the Bush administration. Bush did use waterboarding, which is ineffective and dehumanizing and one of his many failures, because he was not a good president. But the atrocities committed by soldiers in Abu Ghraib were their own choice. The fact they even tried and convicted the perpetrators of the abuse in the first place is evidence enough of that. Even if their sentences were light compared to the severity of their crimes, they are pretty serious by the standards of soldiers in a war zone. Most countries wouldn't even take a second glance at their soldiers abusing prisoners. I'm not trying to undercut the severity of their abuses by using that word, by the way. We just live in 1984 and I don't want to get flagged for using the correct words to describe their crimes. Secondly, you have the collateral murder videos from WikiLeaks, or as I like to call it, the good ending to Nightcrawlers. So Julian Assange has admitted that he deceptively edited the video and lied to maximize political impact. If you look at their version, then it does sound bad. But then when you look at all of the information about the incident, you get a clearer picture of what happened, and the narrative falls apart. So Saeed and Namir were two independent photojournalists working for Reuters who that morning had met with a group of armed Iraqi insurgents so they could take photos of them, and that is the most generous explanation for what happened to them. There is a theory that they were actually working as spotters for the insurgents by taking photographs of American positions so that armed insurgents with rocket launchers could visualize their target before launching their attacks. This is also why Reuters didn't publish any of the reports or videos of the attack, even though the United States Army gave all of that information to them for their insurance claim. They didn't want people to hear the breaking news that Reuters was paying dudes to make snuff films starring American soldiers in Iraq. Anyways, the proto-ISIS insurgents attacked an American convoy, and then later the Apache bombed them, and the journalists they were hanging out with either got caught in the crossfire or were martyred for the cause. The airstrike on the van was more dubious but falls squarely within the fog of war. The assumption by the gunner was that the van was attempting to recover weapons or wounded insurgents, when in reality it was a guy driving his kids to school, and so they got caught in the crossfire. It's more telling that out of all the information that Chelsea Manning gave to the Russians, the worst thing they could find about the United States was a video of them killing their enemies in self-defense in a war. Ultimately, the Iraq War saved and improved the lives of millions of people in the Middle East, and at least 1/3 of the people who died in the war deserved it according to Iraq body count. The biggest tragedy is that they didn't invade under the first Bush and save the country another decade of Saddam Hussein's rule. Also, most of the criticisms of the conduct and outcome of the war could also be applied to the Second World War. But the layman is too ignorant of both conflicts to let the Second World War leave a bad taste in their mouth. But that's a video for another day. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you learned anything, or if you want to argue with me about it. Until next time, this has been Divest.